So the sexual orientation change efforts, this article came out last July by John Blaznik and others. And it was drawn to my attention by Christopher Rozic, who wanted to write a kind of letter to the editor pushing back on this article. And so I looked it up and read it. This study is the strongest evidence that we have to date that SOCE causes suicide. And it uses the Williams Institute's generations data, which is based on a representative population of 1,518 sexual minority adults in the United States. And the data were released shortly after the article was published. So here's the APA resolution on sexual orientation change efforts. Came out last February. And it says here, whereas sexual minority youth and adults who have undergone SOCE are significantly more likely to experience suicidality and depression than those who have not undergone SOCE. And this elevated risk of suicidality, including multiple suicide attempts, persists when adjusting for the risk factors. They're saying SOCE causes suicide. It's the major reason given for a ban on this practice. Because you're going to kill people if you put them through this kind of therapy. And it goes on. It repeats this in several different ways. But what I want to notice is it cites this study. Altogether, it cites this study 4 different times throughout this whole statement as justification for this claim. Well, here's the abstract from the study. It says that they found that after adjusting for demographics and ACEs, these are adverse child experiences, like your parents split up, you grew up with someone who had mental illness, you were sexually abused or physically abused, and a number of other such experiences. So they add these up. They said that sexual minorities, after doing this, were exposed to SOCE had nearly twice the odds of lifetime suicidal ideation. 75% increased odds of planning to attempt suicide and 88% increased odds of suicide attempt. So who would want to promote something that's going to cause this kind of outcome? So I took a look at the data. What I discovered after examining the data is that this entire study is an elaborate falsehood. It's not only not true, its conclusions are emphatically the opposite of the truth. So try and hang on and come along with me. I'll explain to you my discoveries and my reasoning. See if you agree, or maybe you don't agree. The measures for suicidality on the data did you ever have thoughts of killing yourself? Did you ever think about how you might do it? That's called suicidal planning. Did you ever have an intention to act on thoughts of wishing you were dead or trying to kill yourself? Suicide intention. That's often also called a suicidal declaration because it usually is associated with making a statement that you're going to kill yourself. And then did you ever make a suicide attempt? These are 4 common measures of suicidality that are used in the suicide research literature to characterize that. They could say, no, I haven't done that, or they could say, yes, I did it once, or yes, more than once. If they answered once or more than once, there was a follow-up question that said, well, when did you do it? And if they did it more than once, they say, when was the first time you thought about suicide, and when was the most recent time you thought about suicide? So these are wonderful, excellent measures of suicidality. Now, what Blaznik did not do in his association of suicide with SOCE is to consider how much of the suicidality people were talking about happened before they went to the SOCE therapy. Because in the data, we know when they went to SOCE therapy, we know when they expressed the suicidality. So I thought that might be interesting to look at, and so I separated those out, and here are the results. For suicidal ideation, 65% of the ideation expressed happened before the person went to SOCE. Planning 50%, for the others it's about half that happened before. Now why is that important? Because the claim here is that people who've been to SOCE are twice as likely to experience suicidality as those who've not been to SOCE. It sounds like if you go to SOCE, you're going to come out wanting to kill yourself. But what happens if most of the suicidality the people are expressing happened before they ever went to SOCE? Could that be caused by going to SOCE? Is it possible someone could think about suicide at age 14 because at age 18, later on, they were going to go to SOCE, and somehow it mystically, no, that's impossible. And so what we're looking at is the logic of causation, which we've known since Aristotle, right? A cause has to come before an effect in this particular space-time order. But Blaznik and his compatriots completely ignore this. And so they have reported an elaborate falsehood. Think about people who go to dialysis because they have kidney failure. And if you did a study of people in dialysis and you come out with this great finding, did you know that 95% of people who go to dialysis have experienced kidney failure? Let's ban dialysis. That way, we'll do away with all the kidney failure. That's the logic that you're seeing put forth here. And I use the word logic advisedly. It's a lack of logic in this particular study. So after controlling for pre-existing suicidality, all the associations of SOCE and suicidality that are reported by Blaznik and company disappear. Now, these are risk estimates. 1.0 means it's not more likely or less likely. If it's more than 1, then it's a positive risk. If it's less than 1, it's a negative risk. So here, this bar here, which is suicide ideation, 1.93, that's what was reported by Blaznik. And so it means almost 2 times. More likely to think about suicide if they've been to SOCE. These are his original results. I replicated his models. These are the corrected results. And you can see that all of them, except this one, are less than 1. They're all less likely. This one is still more than 1, but it's not statistically significant. These are the error bars. You can see it's well within the margin of error. So Blaznik's conclusions are simply false. SOCE does not promote higher suicidality, but that's not all. There's more to be said in this. The effect of SOCE is very different for those who experience SOCE as a minor, as a child, than if they were an adult. And here are the findings disaggregated in that way. You can see that for those who went to SOCE when they were children, this is under age 18, there's still positive results, but none of them are significant, right? But for those who went as an adult, all of the predicted outcomes are less than 1. SOCE reduces suicidality for those who went when they were over the age of 18. And for suicide attempts, you notice that the error bar doesn't cross the 1.0 barrier here, which means that this is a statistically significant reduction. If you go to SOCE as an adult and you're in any way inclined to attempt suicide, you are now statistically significantly less likely to attempt suicide. That's why I titled this study, which is currently in the final stages of review, SOCE reduces suicide, because that's what this outcome says. These 3 types of suicidality, that is ideation, planning, and intention, are not actually correlated with suicide attempts. They have a separate structure. And this comes out of the suicidality literature, but people who think about suicide or plan for suicide are not necessarily going to attempt suicide. It takes a certain amount of a jump to do that. So the This is a 0.19 ratio, which means that the risk of suicide following SOCE is reduced by 81%. That's a pretty huge reduction, but that's not all. There's more. For all forms of suicidality, you can also look at the persons who repeated their suicidal behavior. Because remember, they asked not only did you think about suicide, but did you do it more than once? And you say, yes, more than once. And we get a measure of multiple attempts. And so using that measure, these bars report the percent who repeated each of these behaviors. So these are people who thought about committing suicide, went to SOCE, and then thought about it again. And that happened 79% of the time. With no SOCE, 73%. And then if they thought about it during or after they went to SOCE, it was only 57%. So having gone to SOCE reduces the prevalence of repeat suicidal behavior, right? And so you have this pattern. You have those who have not yet been to SOCE, those who never did go to SOCE, and those are pretty similar in all these outcomes, but those who have been to SOCE are much less likely to repeat each form of suicidal behavior. You have this pattern. You can see the same pattern here, the same pattern here. Intention is a little different. Those who have been to SOCE are a little more likely than those before, and those who have never been to SOCE are a little more likely. So this is a different structure, we might say, of prediction for that. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. But that's not all. You can look at it another way. The most serious form of suicidality, of course, is a suicide attempt. As I said, it's not really correlated with the others. The others can be generally predictive in different ways of suicide attempts, but not necessarily. But here, you say, okay, how many persons made a suicide attempt following an initial expression of suicidal behavior, like suicidal ideation? They thought about suicide, and then they went on to attempt suicide. With no SOCE, 36% of those who thought about suicide went on to attempt it. With intervening SOCE, only 10%. So these are people who thought about suicide, and they went to SOCE, and then they went on to attempt suicide. That is drastically reduced. Same with suicide planning, suicide intention. It's reduced less for suicide attempt. This is a different structure of prediction. It's still lower, but not as much. And this is not a statistically significant reduction in suicide attempts. This is the same outcome, the propensity to go on and attempt suicide following an initial expression of suicidality, only unlike the table the bars we just looked at, this is from a statistical model that controls for all the demographic factors. And it divides into those who went to SOCE as a minor and those who went as an adult. And like we saw before, if they go to as an adult, there's a much stronger effect to reduce suicidality. Notice first that all of the bars here are below the line. The risk of suicide is reduced across the board for those who go to SOCE, but it's reduced far more for those who go as an adult. These are hugely, dramatically large reductions here. This 0.06 means that the risk of attempting suicide following thoughts of suicide for those who go to SOCE as an adult is reduced by 94%. It's reduced by 96% if we're talking about suicide planning. It's reduced by 96% if we're talking about suicide intention. It's reduced by 32% and not significantly if we're talking about a suicide attempt. Well, here we're talking about someone who's attempted suicide and then goes to SOCE. They're a little bit less likely to attempt it again, but they're kind of a repeat attempter already. But that's not all. That's all from this study. One thing I try to do is to see, are there any other studies that came out with similar findings? And here I look at the much maligned Shidlo and Schroeder study. I'm not sure what people's problems are with this study. They did start out recruiting persons to document the damage of SOCE therapy. But that was only the first 20 cases, and then they saw that some people weren't damaged by it at all, so they changed their protocol, this is right in their study, to say, well, show us whether it was effective or not. Much more neutral appeal. So you're still welcome to dislike that study, but in the study, they publish a lot of raw findings in paragraphs, and one of them is on suicidality, so I looked at it. I don't think anybody has really worked out the math on this, but if you do, it strongly agrees with the findings I've just shown you. In Shidlo and Schroeder, they had 202 SOCE participants. 29% of them had a history of suicide attempts before the SOCE. Of this 29%, only 5.4% attempted suicide after they went to SOCE in that study. 24% attempted suicide shortly before or during SOCE, the way they measure it. And of these, 88% did not reattempt following SOCE. Only 2.5% of the persons in their study initiated a first suicide attempt after SOCE. So, these are not strongly definitive findings, but it seems to confirm the fact that going to SOCE reduces a person's propensity to commit suicide or to attempt suicide. And so what we're looking at here is, in the same data, a statistical model of suicide attempts. How are we going to predict suicide attempts? And the purpose of this statistical model was to test the effect of minority stress. Now, you just heard in the previous presentation all about the minority stress theory. The inventor of the minority stress theory published a study last February using these same data in which he attempted to show the change in minority stress over time since the 1960s and the change in suicide since the 1960s. And what he thought he was going to find was that minority stress declined and suicide declined, and isn't that a wonderful thing? And we should have policies that continue to suppress discrimination against LGBT populations so that their suicide will go down. Well, he didn't find that. He found, in fact, that minority stress did not decline, so he says. And he found that suicidality among the younger folk also did not decline, so he says. And if I had more time or you're interested, I can send this to you. I unpack that and find that those are both also elaborate falsehoods. In fact, minority stress declined a lot since the 1960s, but he kind of covered that up in the way he measured it. Suicidality not only did not decline, it went up dramatically since the 1960s, but I'm going to spare you that because we have 10 minutes, or now maybe 8 minutes. And this is the final model that I come at when I look at it this way. So this looks at suicide attempts in the past year. And so we're no longer looking at lifetime suicide attempts, and so we don't have quite the same level of problem controlling for pre-existing suicidality. And what I did in this model was to take all of the measures of minority stress that are included in these data. There are 12 of them, and I put them into this model. We're predicting suicide from the type of relationship a person is in, social support, physical health, these two measures of mental health, the ACEs, and these other variables. But down here I put in all 11, I put in 11 of the discrimination measures because one of them was significant. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the remaining 11 of them were not significant. This is a way to measure the contribution of a variable to the model. Usually, one variable might be significant or not. Two might be, if you start adding more variables, one of them is going to be significant. But in this case, all 11 measures of minority stress are not significant. None of them help us to understand suicide whatsoever. This is a rigorous test of minority stress theory, and minority stress theory comes up failing. So what does predict suicide? Well, you can see it right here. The most important thing is the kind of relationship a sexual minority person is in. Here's the comparison group, those that are in no relationship at all. And then these are the risk ratios compared to that. So here, if they're married, they have only 44% as higher risk as if they're in no relationship at all. We could say, roughly, they're about half as likely to attempt suicide. If they're cohabiting with someone of the opposite sex, they're about 5 times as likely. If they're cohabiting with someone of the same sex, 4 times as likely. If they're in a non-cohabiting relationship with someone of the opposite sex, also about 4 times as likely. Now remember, this is compared to people that are in no relationship at all. But notice this one. They're in a non-cohabiting relationship with someone of the same sex. They're almost 19 times as likely to attempt suicide as someone that's not in a relationship at all. Now, what are we seeing going on here? What would explain this? Unsatisfying relationships, relationships that are full of conflict, relationships that are transient, relationships where you're not sure of yourself. I'm speculating. It could be other things, but I think what we're looking at are simply unsatisfying relationships. If you are attracted to someone of the same sex and you act out on that attraction, what you're buying into is a very unsatisfying personal experience in your relationships. That's what this is saying. So consistent with that, the higher social support they have, less likely they are to commit suicide or attempt suicide. Poor physical health. They're 7 times more likely to attempt suicide if they have very poor physical health. This is consistent, by the way, with other findings in the research literature. Persons who are sickly or in poor health, much more likely to attempt suicide. One of the major components of poor physical health here is HIV. Persons who have been to SOCE are about 4 times more likely to be HIV positive than persons who haven't. They have a much lower physical health in that way. The Kessler scale, these are measures of psychological distress, poor mental health in the past month. They contribute, but it's a very small contribution. You can see you're 16% more likely. ACEs also contribute, but not much. Here is the low connection with the LGBT community. So sexual minority persons who are disconnected from the LGBT community are 4 times less likely to commit suicide or attempt suicide. I keep saying that wrong. And so there's a sense of being independent or distant from the LGBT mix that promotes health. This is not an expected finding for most of the people that are going to look at these data, but here it is. Now, these findings are randomized findings, we might say. They don't fit any particular theory, and I don't know whether we're going to keep them in the final model, but here they are. You're almost 4 times more likely to commit suicide if you're a member of the Democratic Party. You know, I'm a Democrat myself, so I'm in danger here. If you don't have any religious affiliation, you're 3 times more likely to commit suicide. That's going to stay in the final model. That's a very strong finding there. That connects with data for persons who are undergo SOCE. They tend to be more religious than the rest of the sexual minority population in a number of ways. Here is that minority stressor that was significant. And it's SOCE therapy. You see, in the minds of the people who put together these data, SOCE therapy is a stressor. It increases your difficulty as a sexual minority person. But actually, as you can see here, it reduces your risk of suicide by a factor of about 3. And so it's the only minority stressor that's significant, but it's significant in the opposite way of those who put these together think about. Women are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than men. That's consistent with the rest of the suicide literature. Those who identify as bisexual are also more likely to attempt suicide. That's also consistent with what we know of other sexual minority literature. So what we're doing is pushing back and trying to predict what actually does promote suicide as a way of pushing back against the false agenda. Okay, I'm going to pause here. Do we have time for questions? Yes? All right. I would love to have some questions if you want. Yes?
I noticed, Paul Sullins, that married, opposite sex, and same sex reduces by a factor of 2, or you're half as likely to commit suicide.
Right.
Yes. Is there a distinction between opposites?
Yes, there is. There is, and I'm not sure you're going to like it, but I'll tell you what it is. I had to combine these 2 categories because in one of them, there are 0 cases of suicide attempts. In the other one, there's only a few. But in one of those categories, no one in these data attempted suicide, which is a really striking finding. And that's those who are in same-sex marriages. So being married to a member of the opposite sex reduces the risk of suicide quite a lot. But being married to someone of the same sex, if you're a sexual minority person, it seems to eliminate it completely in these data. So you can do what you want with your theology and so on with that. I'm working on it myself, but that's the truth as it comes out from these data. And I'd be happy to hear any speculations about why that might be the case.
Thank you very much. It's very valuable reanalyzing, yes, of the research. I have 2 questions. These are observations and questions because I would like to learn if I observed correctly. First is that in the first study there was over 1,500 in the sample, but there was like 50, about 100 of men and women, who undergone SOCE. So in fact, it was a study of 100 people in SOCE, so just saying that it's 1,500 would be a little bit. So that's one. And a second, when we are measuring effectiveness of a given intervention, it's very important to define what actual intervention we are talking about.
Yes.
And did I understand correctly that this was many kinds of SOCE put together, but how intensive, right. What kinds of? Because otherwise we don't even know what it means that it, for example, reduces by 37%, or it makes suicides double according to this official review.
That's right. Good. Thank you very much.
Well, now I'm in stereo.
These are great questions. So first of all, in a population sample study, we have a sample that represents the entire population, and that's 1,518 persons. And then the subsets of that population are represented by smaller groups of people. So if we compare men and women, it's about 60-40 in this sample. I'm not sure exactly what it would be about 700-800 to 500 or so. We wouldn't say, well, this is only a sample of 500 because we're only looking at men, right? We're comparing them. So as long as we're comparing one part of the sample to the other, we're still using the entire sample, right? Because we have the variance of the comparison group that we're comparing also with the variance of the group. So in the SOCE group, we have 6%, actually 6.6% of this sample are persons who have been to SOCE. It's not that many. It's 108, right? And you're right, it's a small group, but it's not that small for this kind of research, really. And then we compare that with the 93 point whatever % that have not been to SOCE.
and we can come up with good, valid comparisons. But you're right, it's a small group, and that's why a lot of these comparisons that I might want to make are not statistically significant, because the comparison group is so small. With regard to the different kinds of SOCE, we talked about this somewhat this morning, because it was a criticism of another study, the study that was retracted and then we reasserted. And the criticism was that they didn't differentiate the kinds of SOCE. Well, the reason is because there are so many different kinds. If you did that, you only have 108 people to begin with. If you said, well, these are the ones that went to talk therapy, these are the ones that had a study course, these are the ones that it was religious, pretty soon you'd be having little teeny groups of 3 or 4, and you wouldn't be able to say anything at all. So they've aggregated a diversity of experience under this term. It is, after all, called sexual orientation change efforts, plural. And so it's intended to be kind of a basket term. They did ask a follow-up question about whether it was religious or not, the SOCE that they went to. So you could look at the comparative effectiveness or results of religious versus some other form of SOCE, but there are not enough cases to do much with it. Thank you. Great question. Dr. Haynes, with trepidation, I'm handing you this mic. Please.
Regarding the finding of being in a same-sex marriage eliminates suicidality, are you aware of research on the length of same-sex relationships in comparison to opposite-sex relationships? So there may be a possibility that this is a honeymoon effect.
Yeah, very good. And especially if I tell you when the data were collected. Do you know when the data were collected here? 2016. So what happened in 2015 in the United States? Yes, same-sex marriage was declared to be legal by judicial fiat. And so all of a sudden, like that, gay people could get married. So how long do you think most of these same-sex marriages in this data set have been in existence? Maybe a year. Yeah, I would say better than 90%, not more than 2 years. And so it is very likely that they are in the honeymoon period, if that's the right term for a same-sex marriage. And so, these effects we might find out something different if we did the same study in a decade or so. But we don't know that. It is a striking finding that there are no suicide attempts among persons in same-sex marriages, and I think we should just acknowledge that. It's really remarkable. Despite the ways we might think that it might be artifactual, it might be due to other things. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Maybe my question goes in a similar direction. This non-cohabiting same-sex is 18.
Yeah.
And the cohabiting same-sex is 4.
Yeah.
So could that be used or misused or whatever, or used for promoting civil unions, or even promoting same-sex marriage, because it's sort of at least better than just non-cohabiting? And
yes, I think that it could be used to promote cohabiting relationships versus non-cohabiting sexual relationships in all kinds of settings, right? And I'm sorry about that. I've published findings before that are positive to the idea of same-sex marriage or educational outcomes. It's possible to use any finding in any number of ways, but it's much less possible to do that in the long run with true findings. And so my goal is to publish true findings. And sooner or later, the truth will come out about these things. Now, I don't think that it would be a bad thing to compare same-sex cohabitations with same-sex non-cohabiting relationships. Clearly, in my mind, the cohabitations would be preferred. The question is comparing the same-sex cohabitations and non-cohabitations with opposite-sex cohabitations and non-cohabitations, and with marriage it gets complicated and messy. But in most every data set that I know of, the gold standard, the best form of relationship is a long-term, opposite-sex, married relationship. That's not here in these data. But I think that if we did that kind of comparison, and by the way, you could find population data that's similar to this and do the comparisons. I'm confident that you would find that persons that are in a lifelong heterosexual marriage that's intact, that's been in existence for a long time, are going to have way lower suicide attempt rates than those who are in these. That's my conviction. It's not an empirical evidence that I have for that. But I think that's really the important finding. Thank you very much.